this planet's empty. I see no signs of life. Please don't tell me that the human race did not survive. There are no people in the future. There are no people. There are no people in the future. No people at all. There are no people in the future. Where did all my people go? There are no people in the future. Let me try my people call.
Welcome to Raging Chickens Out the Coop Live. Yes, it is our call-in show for Monday, December 14th, 2020. On Out the Coop Live, we talk to progressives, activists, and troublemakers of all sorts, from our own backyards, across the country, and beyond. On Fridays, Sean Kitchen and I break down the good, bad, and the ugly in state and national politics, but you can get both this show and our Friday show by subscribing to our podcast on Podbean, iTunes, Spotify, wherever you get your podcasts. But you can only join the conversation live through Podbean app on Mondays, right? Or actually on our YouTube page. You can head on over to our YouTube page too as well if, kind of calling into the app is not your thing. But either way, that's the way you can guarantee that you can see us live. You can help support this show by becoming a patron for as little as $5 a month. Just go to patreon.com/rcpress. And if you're listening to this show on the Podbean app, well, you can show us some love right now. You can drop a few bucks in our tip jar by clicking that little gift icon at the bottom of your screen. Yep, you fill your digital pockets with Podbean's golden beans. I kid you not, that is what they call them. Golden beans, like we're in some sort of freaking fairy tale. Anyways, let us send you can send us a gift of your choice, and every gift that you send helps support and expand this podcast. If you're looking for more PA-based progressive talk, tune in to the Rick Smith Show live stream at 9 p.m. Eastern on his YouTube channel, Twitter, Facebook, or subscribe to his podcast wherever you get your podcast. And a special shout out to Jonathan Mann, who wrote our intro song, There Are No People in the Future. Check out all his great stuff on his YouTube page and follow him on Twitter at Song a Day Man. That's at Song a Day Man. That's with 2 N's, Song a Day Man. Not there. Amulia, yeah, you'll be able to talk in a little bit. You'll be able to call in kind of the show, probably the second half of the show. We'd love to have you. Love to hear from you. You can certainly put stuff in the chat. On today's show, we are joined by Paris Marx, creator and host of the podcast Tech Won't Save Us. Paris is a socialist writer whose critical perspectives on technology have been published by NBC News, Jacobin, Tribune, In These Times, OneZero, Recode, Citymetric, Salon, and more. And trust me, there's lots more. Paris is a PhD student at the University of Auckland. By the way, I saw this on your Twitter, Paris. Congratulations. You can be that you're just starting that up. Isn't that correct?
Yeah. Thanks so much. I'm still in Canada for the moment, but yeah, once the border rules, allow, I'll head down there.
Awesome. Well, he'll be down there, University of Auckland, and I'm going to ask you to kind of, I'll send you money to send me a labor T-shirt from once you get down there. So they don't ship to the U.S. at this point, so I need a contact. But
Sounds
anyways,
good.
Yeah. So he'll be researching tech futures. He completed his master's in urban geography from McGill University. And they are also writing a book about transportation and technology for Verso Books. Now, the podcast Tech Won't Save Us challenges the notion that tech alone can drive our world forward by showing that separating tech from politics has consequences for us all, especially the most vulnerable. The show isn't simply about tearing down tech. It also presents radical ideas for a better world and better technology. Recent shows have included, I want to give you this little context, everybody, because it gives you a really, I think, solid perspective about why I was very excited to have Paris on and why I wanted him on the show to begin with. So recently you had Emma Kinema on the show. She's a former tech and games worker who was a campaign lead with the Communication Workers of America on the campaign to organize digital employees. She also co-founded Game Workers United. You also had freelance writer and critic Liz Pelly discussing how the Spotify model of streaming music continues a long trend of exploitation in the music industry and why musicians need to organize around a vision for a different world of music. And Will Evans, a reporter from Reveal from the Center of Investigative Reportings, he was on there discussing his investigative reporting on how excessive productivity targets are causing high rates of injury at Amazon warehouses, how executives have misled the public about the problem, and what that suggests about the impacts of the company's customer obsession. You can check out his show at techwon'tsave.us or techwon'tsave.us, I should say, techwon'tsave.us. And you can subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcast. You can also follow him on Twitter at Paris Marx. Follow the podcast at techwon'tsaveus. And you can actually help support his podcast by going to patreon.com/techwon'tsaveus. Paris, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to chat today.
Yeah, me too. And I think that, I was really psyched. I've been mulling it around for a while. I'm like, okay, yeah, I got this guy from Pennsylvania reaching out for, a tech podcaster up in Canada. Like, what's the possibility that puts us in the same world, right? But I think that, one of the reasons why I thought this would be a good conversation to have, and why I wanted to kind of help, in my view at least, kind of signal boost your podcast as best as I can from where we sit, is because you seem to be one of the few places out there that is bringing together, say, left critiques, right, of the tech industry. Now, I'm not suggesting that there's not great work that's going on out there, but the sole focus of your podcast is kind of like you said, is get that critical focus, right, from a left perspective on tech, particularly this kind of world vision, right, this kind of techno-utopia that we get from Silicon Valley. So I wonder if you could kind of walk us through a little bit about like the thinking behind getting that podcast started and what you're trying to do with it.
Absolutely, yeah. As you say, like there is more and more great kind of tech criticism or like critical tech reporting that's going on. Like I think Motherboard, the Vice's kind of technology vertical is really good at that. I think OneZero does a really good job. And there are some other publications and specific writers that I turn to a lot to see what they're saying. But in general, I still think that the broad conversation that we have about technology is really lacking in these kind of critical perspectives and is really still focused on like business metrics and consumer products and things like that. And sure, we need some of that, but we also need to be paying attention to like the deeper questions of what these tech companies, what these tech executives are doing to our world, right? And so that's kind of the goal of the podcast, is to find people who have really critical left-wing perspectives on technology that I think we need to hear from, and that can help to better inform the way that we see technology and the major tech companies. And then, to give them a platform to kind of, explain what the issues they see in, whatever topic it is that they focus on are, so that more people can kind of develop that critical perspective on technology and on so many of these tech issues that is lacking, and that will be necessary if we do want to kind of seize technology in the sense of ensuring that it isn't just working to create profits for these major corporations, but is actually like improving our world, in ensuring that we can communicate with one another in a way that is like positive and building community and kind of building the organizations that we want to see in the world, and that is ultimately making the world a better place for the people who live in it, not just for the big corporations who kind of suck up all the money out of it.
Yeah, and it's, I like the fact too that, the way that you come at this by saying that, okay, look, it's not just about tearing this stuff down, right? It's about kind of imagining these kind of radical possibilities that kind of come out in different versions. And I can't help but think of you ever read that book, Looking Backwards by Edward Bellamy?
No, I'm still meaning to, but I know it's one that so many people have. Yeah.
So this is like 1,000 people have said this year, right? But it's like, what always struck me about that book, right, is about that book was kind of saying like, okay, let's project into the future, very, very in a very similar way that kind of Star Trek does. Like I know you've written about this and kind of made this connection before too as well, about when the realm of fiction, kind of imagining what it might look like in kind of where technology was putting at the service of kind of solving human need, right, as opposed to the accumulation of profit. And I don't want to simplify the discussion so much, but I think that there's this weird dynamic, which I don't even know what you would call it, but these tech giants in Silicon Valley present us with this kind of this kind of like utopian ideology that is like clean and sparkling about the future, right? That it's all about gadgets, it's all about the surface, it's all about the shine. Except and of course what that, leaves out is like, well, how we get all that shit, right? I mean, how we get it, like, who's mining this stuff, right, within, in Africa in order to get the elements that go into these products? Who's actually assembling these iPhones and other technologies in China and some of the sweatshops, right? And what are the conditions of the people delivering all these goods, right, and having to work harder and harder in this gig economy? And what I always struck by what you're doing in this podcast is really kind of saying, okay, there's the shine, right? And we all recognize the shine. Like, there's probably nobody who's sitting here right now, well, obviously if you're listening to it on the Podbean app, who's not doing it on a cell phone, right? It's not anti-technology, but it's saying that the structural and the kind of social relations with which this technology is embedded leads us to a direction in which, like, exploitation is only ramping up, as opposed to a different perspective which will allow us to see a different kind of future. Would that be a fair characterization?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I think you've hit kind of the two key points there, right? It's not only to, I guess, like, firstly, to kind of broaden out from the perspectives that we so often get, right? Like, say, when a new iPhone or some kind of new tech product is launched, it's like, wow, like, look at how sleek this is. Look at how nice it looks. Look at the new features that are in this new product, right? But there's very little there's very little written about what actually goes into creating that product, right? At the moment that it gets released, there's just this fetishization of the product itself. And you don't hear about the people, as you say, who are mining those metals in, Africa, South America, other parts of the world, the people who are assembling them in China, in India, in Brazil, the people who are selling them, and, more broadly, as you mentioned, the people who are working through these various apps and whatnot, right? Like, the kind of broader impact of these technologies is ignored or doesn't get the amount of focus that I think it should, at least, because then by not seeing these things, we miss the real human impact and the deeper impact of what is happening, right? The exploitation. But as you mentioned as well, there's also kind of the future-oriented aspect of this, right? When so many of these companies kind of put out their big visions or their big solutions or whatever it is to the problems that we face, it's kind of blind in a way, right? It's like it's developed by a PR or marketing department to sound so fantastically amazing. And then what we always find is that they never actually deliver on this vision. Like, Elon Musk is obviously the best example, but I think Uber does that as well, right? We've had 10 years of Uber, and Uber promised us that they were going to reduce traffic congestion, reduce emissions, reduce car ownership, serve the underserved, like all of these things that sound really amazing. And what we have now found, like, the academic work that has been done to see what effect Uber has actually had on cities, finds that it makes traffic congestion worse, that it's hardly affected car ownership, that emissions have gone up because of Uber, that the people who are usually being served are disproportionately young, urban, college educated, and in the US earning over $70,000 a year, and in Toronto over $100,000 Canadian, right? So these are not the kind of disadvantaged people who do not have transportation options. Right. It's people who are already privileged, who are more likely to be working at these tech companies. They are seeing the benefit of these products, not the people who are really suffering, who are being forced out of their homes as their rents are going up, who are being forced to work on these gig platforms. Like, this is just completely outside the vision. And so we get distracted by these really shiny futures when actually what these products are doing, at least in the way that things are currently composed, is kind of making the world worse for the majority of the people who, I think we should really be caring about and paying attention to when we discuss technologies and its impacts.
Yeah, and I think that the example of Uber too as well, we can see things get even darker once Uber starts exporting these things to kind of like, say, the non-Western world, right, to the global South. And we saw these stories come out from Kenya, right? In Nairobi in particular, where they started picking up the app and Uber started doing a strong push in there, but required all their drivers to have these larger cars. So these drivers then went out, right? Of course, not having a whole lot of money, had to buy larger cars. Now they've got loan payments, right? And then once they get them, they start driving. Then they change the conditions on the app, so that they say, nope, now you can have any car you want. But meanwhile, those workers are essentially now indentured servants, right, to Uber, because now they have to have all these payments going into these large cars, and they're making virtually nothing, especially after they change their kind of algorithm to determine who gets the ride. So it's like, it gets pushed down, and like you start to see that who is visible within their vision, right, are exactly the people. You talk about a professional middle class who actually, these services do provide a very concrete solution to, right? The frustration, especially, in the U.S., we're like horrible down here when it comes to public transportation, right? So that if you're in anywhere that's outside of a major city, right, getting around from place to place is virtually impossible. So then you see something like Uber coming in being like, oh God, at least I can do this, and this feels like good, but, right, that's only true at the point of service as a consumer, not with actually the people that are kind of working on the other end. And the squeeze just seems to get like more and more as the years go on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the Kenyan example you provide is, so illustrative of what they do. But, we've seen similar things in Egypt and in many other countries where they've operated. And, even earlier on, what we've seen is they would enter markets like India, Mexico, Brazil, and obviously their product, their service was subsidized by venture capital, so they could offer a fare that was lower than taxi companies, not because their model was more efficient, but because they had all this money so they could price below cost. And in those markets, then you had taxi drivers who couldn't earn an income anymore. All of a sudden, like they lost their income like overnight, basically, because Uber came in. There was no real solution for these people. And this, some of this was in Mike Isaac's book, Super Pump. Mm-hmm. What ended up happening is like these taxi drivers, in some cases, were really angry. And then they would kind of seek out the Uber drivers, attack them, steal from them, whatever, because they had taken their livelihoods. And Uber basically did nothing, right, to protect these drivers, but also they ensured that it was incredibly easy for people to just sign up to the app and start using it, in many cases not even requiring a background check or to even check the identity of the person who signed up to say that they were actually who they were representing themselves to be. And that also put riders in danger, right? And not just in Brazil or Mexico, but that's also true in the United States, where, taxi drivers in New York City committed suicide because of how Uber just decimated their livelihoods. Riders have been, riders have been discriminated against and assaulted and what have you, because they didn't do the proper checks to make sure the people who were driving the vehicles should be. But they're like, those are just a few more examples of when you zoom out to the bigger picture, you just see that there's this corporation that is doing so much harm in so many ways. And it's just been allowed to steamroll over regulations, steamroll over workers' rights, just completely redefine this kind of regulatory framework, because instead of governments pushing back and saying wait, you are basically a taxi company, you're not a tech company. They just completely accepted that vision and that justification that Uber put forward, because these tech companies just get lauded in this way that I don't understand at all. But yeah, and then we just have really negative consequences that come of it, because not only do workers not have the power to fight back against these companies because of how unions have been decimated, they don't have working rights like they had in the past, but then you also have governments that are completely in tow to these corporations and not actually looking out for working people.
Absolutely. And, I think that, one of the points you were making there, too, about the regulatory frameworks that they kind of decimated, it's, almost all of these big tech companies that are fundamentally kind of, basically changing the architecture of our social infrastructure. It's basically what they do is they start from breaking the law. right? I mean, it starts from running over the law and utilizing their power, right? Their sheer capital, right? Run it over. And I was like, because we just saw that the, SpaceX just tested its Starship last week, and it comes down and crashes and burns, right? And this is kind of like gets celebrated in the SpaceX models. Like, yep, Elon Musk loves the fact that you might as well keep on failing and blowing up rockets, because then you get the data from that, right? And you can use it. That's better than the NASA model, which is to carefully study things and making sure all the safety protocols are there to begin with, right? And I think that's a great model for like how these folks proceed. They go into a market, they go into an industry, and they just blow shit up. Right. And they just kind of say, we're going to run over stuff. We're going to steamroll it to the point where, local officials, city officials, state officials, right, can't keep up, and then build up a consumer base to the point where they're, well, what are you going to do? Piss off our customers? Pissed off your citizens? And then having citizens show up and actually demand that, no, you should allow Uber to do this. It's like the most messed up way of moving forward, but it just shows you what happens when we kind of hand over this kind of influence and this kind of power, to this billionaire class.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's hard to see like the negative potential impacts of a SpaceX when you're just paying attention to like their launch program and things like that, because it just seems like, like we are swapping out like a public company that does that for a private company. But I think like the potential harm of like the move fast and break things model being applied to space is actually seen best in like the Starlink proposal, or not even proposal at this point. Like, there are plenty of satellites that are already up there. And, this was something that they just proceeded with. Obviously they had to get approvals for it, I imagine, from the US government. But then what happens is, so basically Starlink is, the idea is that these thousands of like low orbit satellites will be put into orbit, and then that will allow like internet to be offered even in like rural places, like all over the world, right?
Right, which is a laudable pursuit, right? I mean, so I think at the most, and this is how everything works at the broad level, right? Hey, that sounds good. Who could be against this, right?
Yeah. No, exactly. Like it sounds like it's this really positive thing. But then you learn that, actually what that's going to do is make it like really difficult for like scientists, astronomers to look at the night sky, to observe like, whatever is going on in space. I'm, not a space science expert or anything, right. But to do their sciencey stuff.
Sciencey stuff.
Yeah. But it gets in the way of all that. And like, there was no real consultation. There was no like, should Elon Musk be able to put all these satellites there for his corporate goals? And like, what are the trade-offs of that? Not only for the scientists, but like, this is something that's unilaterally being done by a US company. Like, what's kind of the effects on that? The effects of that on other countries around the world, right? And there's some people who've been saying that like, once these go up, like the night sky won't look the same either.
Right.
And it's like, I think it's just these deeper questions of like, why are we letting these billionaires like trample all over everything? And why do we have no power to make these decisions on our own? And, like, I think when it comes to space, there's this even deeper question about like whether we should even allow kind of like capitalism and private companies to operate outside of, the bounds of Earth. And, obviously I'm against that. But like, it's just completely missing like the deeper questions that are going on here and the implications of the things that we're doing now, just because there are some companies that like either think they can make massive profits by doing this, or investors are just willing to like plow a bunch of money into it because it seems really cool or something. Like, I don't know. I just think there are so many troubling things here, and I'm really worried about where that's going and how by believing that that is the future, like we're being distracted from other potential routes that we could take or could have taken, instead of taking this one that has, I would say, like really large, like negative outcomes, and some of which I feel like we probably don't even fully know yet, you know?
Absolutely. I want to remind everybody who's listening right now that we are talking to Paris Marx. He is the creator and host of the podcast Tech Won't Save Us. And we're talking about, I don't know, how tech is basically running roughshod over kind of anything that is kind of social, so that you can have a few billionaires have their little sandbox to play in. But let me say that. So just what you were just saying just there kind of reads me to a couple things. One, about, say, the move fast break stuff. Because one of the things that you've been pointing out so much on your podcast and so well, I think, and so effectively, if you just take for two of the examples I gave in the intro today, from Emma Kinema talking about organizing, basically people doing games, right? People designing games, and how behind this kind of like growing and multi-billion-dollar industry, who are these workers who are actually kind of being worked to the bone. Right. And having no recourse. Right. And decisions being made by the owners of those companies. Right. To like, instead of making the workspace a more manageable thing. No. They'd rather work people to the bone. And similarly, right. We're going to break other things too as well. We're going to break people, literally, as we see in kind of the show that you had Will Evans on, talking about what's happening in Amazon warehouses. So I think that, not only do we see the breaking of, say, laws or kind of like norms or kind of regulatory frameworks, we're actually seeing like the breaking, literally, of people, right, on the other end of it, right? So we're talking about even norms that took, say, generations to establish, like workers' rights that were kind of fought for, died for, right, to ensure some kind of element of security or safety. Those are also being wrecked.
Yeah, absolutely. Like I think it just shows how, like, so many of these companies today and these business models are almost dependent on like mistreating workers, being able to underpay workers, being able to take advantage of them, because they know that after like a 4-decade assault on labor rights, that they don't have the power to fight back that they might have in the past, right? And especially, I spoke to Aaron Benenov as well on the podcast, who kind of talked about like the question of automation. And he argued that maybe we're not going to see the kind of full automation that some people say we will. But he explained how there's this kind of overcapacity in the economy, right? And so what we see now is there are all of these workers, all of these people who need jobs. And like, if I guess like a worker tries to like push back against their employer, it's so easy for them just to like fire them and hire someone new, right? Because there are so many, there's such a huge kind of unemployed labor force or group of workers that are looking for jobs, or that are underemployed in their current employment and kind of looking to move up. And I feel like we've seen that progressively expand with like each new economic crisis that we've had. Like, I think it's most pronounced after the 2008 recession, where we had many of these gig companies like coming out of that recession, right? Like Uber is very much a product and the entire gig economy of the 2008 recession, where we had so many people who were in dependable middle-class jobs then come out of that and not have that anymore, and kind of being forced into this lower wage work where they have few protections, no benefits, et cetera, et cetera. And I feel like very confident that the pandemic, recession, or depression, I don't know, whatever that we're in right now,
right,
is just going to accelerate that trend unless workers are able to build that power to be able to push back, to demand these companies treat them properly. But I think also, start to build toward a different kind of technology and a different kind of economy that isn't based first and foremost on kind of exploiting them and decimating their kind of futures.
Right. I always get into these conversations with people and talk about how, God, well, it stinks that you have all this low wage stuff. Well, that's precisely because you have these warehouses that are the Amazon warehouses that are popping up everywhere. And, that's low skilled work. And so, that's just minimum wage and things like this. And you always have to remind people is that, it was also low skilled work, right? Mining and steel work and auto production, right?
Absolutely.
And the only reason that those became well-paying jobs is because workers organized and fought back, right? It wasn't anything in the nature of the function of the job itself. It had to do with collective power, period. And that is precisely, I think, where we're at now, right? Is to say like, no. It's not, those aren't just the throwaway jobs at Amazon, right? Those are like that. They are quickly becoming, unfortunately, like the backbone of this economy. And I think that just what you're just saying there about the pandemic kind of basically put a bright spotlight right on that. Right, in order to get foods and basic things, a lot of people resorted to, these folks who were working these throwaway jobs, and it turns out that those were not throwaway jobs. And it seems like, this is also, despite the challenges that we got because of this freaking pandemic, that there's that opportunity once again, and the workers are taking this opportunity, I should say, right, of beginning to kind of like organize much more kind of pronouncedly, right, building on the wins of the Fight for 15 movement, building on the wins of what SEIU has been doing in organizing low wage workers, but building it around the question of collective power, not about whether or not this kind of work deserves a good wage, but saying all people deserve a living wage and deserve protections in the workplace, period.
Absolutely. Like what we've been seeing in the United States in recent years has been really positive in the sense that, like teachers are organizing more. You see the successes of movements like Fight for 15. You see unionization of newsrooms, organizing by low wage workers, organizing by tech workers. Like there is this growing class consciousness that is like evident for people to see, right? But the issue there is that, it's starting from such like a place where there's so little power already, that there's so much ground that needs to be kind of made up. Right. And that's not to say that like there's no hope in it as well, because every time that these workers, organize, win things, like that is so hopeful and inspiring, I think, at least. Like every time that I see a new success story, or even like, where they're trying their hardest to kind of push back against these companies, like that is incredibly inspiring to me. And I think, it is the beginning of something. And now the question is, because, we've seen workers organizing at like Amazon and Whole Foods during this pandemic. And we've also seen Uber drivers and, other gig economy workers continuing to organize during this pandemic. So far, Amazon has been able to kind of hold off unionization. There's one warehouse in Alabama that is going to have a unionization vote. I don't know when it actually is, but, they filed to have that vote. And so obviously that would be a really positive story if they're able to kind of, make it through all of Amazon's union busting. But I think the other big thing right now, at least that I'm paying attention to, is obviously Prop 22 in California, how that passed, how that, kind of cements a lower class of labor for gig economy workers.
And if that's not, if that is not like a screaming example of the reason why we need to take these people down, I'm sorry, but I mean the money that they put, the money that billionaires did, like the Silicon Valley companies, and have put behind that, the gig, the gig economy folks, the Uber folks, that was one of the most disgusting displays of kind of billionaire influence on our political process that I've seen in a long time.
Absolutely. Like, I completely agree with you. And so I think, like, now, obviously, Uber and these gig companies are trying to roll that out nationally in the United States. I'm sure they're going to try to take it to other countries as well. And so I think, like, the two major fights, at least, that I see, and I'm sure there are more than this, but, like, the two major ones right now are, like, whether workers can make any inroads into unionizing at Amazon. And also whether workers can ensure that Prop 22 is not made like a federal law or rolled out to additional states. And ideally, that there is something that happens on the federal level to kind of reclassify gig workers as employees instead of as contractors. And obviously, those are two massive fights.
Yeah.
That will take, as you said, these gig companies threw everything at the ballot measure and they won, right? And they won because they made people believe that their ballot measure was actually granting gig workers more rights, not taking away their rights. People thought that this was a progressive change, not a regressive one, right?
Exactly.
And so that's a real challenge as well, especially when, you have people who aren't completely informed about these issues. You have a media system that is not doing its due diligence in kind of hashing out these issues for people. And you have a political class that's really, kind of bought by these major companies. And so, obviously it will take a lot of power in order to make these positive changes in order to push back against these companies. But I think that, those are two major ones when we're looking at like 2021 and 2022. Because, if Prop 22 gets cemented, and essentially what Prop 22 is create like a class of worker between contractor and employee so that Uber can keep kind of like not paying gig workers like a proper minimum wage, giving the proper benefits and protections. So if that gets cemented on a federal level, not only can they ensure that happens in every state, but I guarantee you that if the gig companies are able to reclassify workers in this way and deny them employment rights, you will absolutely see more companies trying to do that with their workers too. And so this isn't like just a gig worker fight. It's a fight for all workers, because if gig workers get denied their rights, then just in the same way that unions have been decimated across like pretty much every industry, they're going to do the same thing when it comes to working rights if they have the chance, right?
Absolutely, 100%. And I think that this only gets, and in some ways, the Prop 22 becomes that much more of a problem because I think, they looked at what happened there and they're like, shit, that was easy. So if it was that easy in California, right, we should be able to steamroll over kind of good sections of the country, and then start exporting it everywhere else, right? I mean, that's ultimately the goal. I mean, in so many ways, the U.S. has become, the laboratory for exporting the most anti-worker legislation and work processes that we've seen on the planet. And this is a perfect example of this. If they could steamroll over this, well, hey, that's what we're going to do next. Let's see where this comes up. So this is one of the things that I notice a lot of folks on the left are tracking now. Okay, where are we going to see, these proposals start coming up in New York? Are we going to see this in Pennsylvania? Are we going to see this in Florida? Are we going to see this in other states across the country? And are we going to see it start to make its way into kind of trade negotiations, right? As a way of kind of paving out a global way the kind of, the conditions by which workers even have the rights to petition to. So, I mean, I guess, this is one of the things I should say this, but, before we kind of open this up to calls and things like this, is one of the things that I just kind of want to plug this in some ways. Is that, I first came across your writing from your piece, Jeff Bezos and his billionaire space fantasy in Jacobin. Right.
Yeah.
And I swear to God that I read that piece and I was like, I'm not alone. Right? Because, I grew up, reading sci-fi all the time, and science fiction for me, especially once I kind of stumbled across Kim Stanley Robinson, right? And his Mars trilogy, is like science fiction for me had always been, that space where you can see kind of the tendencies and the contradictions that are taking place in society as it is, and kind of like saying, okay, what happens if we extend that tendency forward? Right. Yeah. And in that piece, you say, okay, yeah, we've got the Star Trek lane, right? We got the Star Trek lane where this is a post-scarcity world, right? To the point where, in one of the last movies where Picard was in, he basically is explaining to the person from the 20th century about how we've gotten beyond capitalism, the exploitation of our fellow human beings, right? So you got that vision of things, which again, if you really want to geek out on this one, we could talk about, where does dilithium mining happen and shit like that, but whatever. But then if you compare that to the Expanse franchise, which Bezos, as you say in that piece, saved, right? That's kind of like, the likely extension of where we are now. Right. I mean, it's kind of to say, like, look, you're going to export this kind of like, billionaire fantasy, kind of techno utopia into the future. But, you're going to subject like huge swaths of the kind of population to like basically, 19th century, 18th century conditions, except mining not kind of like, in the hills of Pennsylvania, but mining on asteroids, right, beyond Mars. I mean, or on the moon for that matter, if you want to be more kind of realistic and more practical. And so you see the kind of like the ideological bent, kind of how this is actually gets placed in, our imaginary, whether it's film or whether it's TV and so on, but then actually seeing these kind of conditions here. And so that's one of the things that, again, that kind of got me to where how I think about this stuff. When I came across that piece there, I said that's exactly it. And before we talked about, I'm just kind of curious about, like, you've mentioned this a couple times now, and I mentioned on our podcast, we have this section in our Friday podcast just called The Last Call, where we talk about beer recommendations, and like I talk about space news and stuff like this. And I've been plugging away at this thing, that I've been calling, say, just galactic capitalism, right, and the galactic capitalist. And really, it's like, I am super concerned that this is just get handed over to these billionaires, right, to do this space privatization. And even under the Trump administration, like the launch of the Space Force, right, this is like deeply concerning to me. And what's bothered me in some of the discussions on the left about this, right, is that it's been a wholesale almost dismissal, right, of that whole space stuff. Right. And basically saying, oh, that's space. That's kind of like, we need to be. Yes, obviously, we need to be paying attention to what the hell's happening here. Obviously. Right. I'm with them 100% on that. But to just kind of like write these folks off as just kind of like, kids like in their playground without actually really thinking about what the implications of this are. I mean, shit, there are corporations right now that have kind of venture capitalists investing money on kind of like looking at the technologies to begin these mining processes, like, of these asteroids. Like, they just kind of came back and tested this one asteroid, and they said, this thing's worth about $100 quadrillion. And you're telling me that there's people here on Earth, these billionaires, that don't have their eyes on that stuff? So I look at that as like, I'm just curious your take on some of that about, yes, obviously everything we've talked about right now is right on the money, but does that scare you as much as it scares me? I guess is really my question about the direction that is going on with these billionaires in terms of their pursuit for the privatization of space.
Absolutely. Like there are so many aspects to that question, right?
Mm-hmm. I'm sorry.
I think I would start by no, that's okay. Kim Stanley Robinson, who you mentioned there, his Mars trilogy, I think, has helped to inspire some of that. Like Elon Musk, I'm pretty sure he specifically said that that's one of his inspirations for colonizing Mars. But he said in a Jacobin interview recently that space mining is like just a fantasy of our time. Like, exactly. It'll never be profitable. It'll never work out, right? And so part of my concern, like, we already kind of got into the privatization aspect of it and kind of not thinking through the broader implications. But the other thing that really concerns me about it is we're getting this kind of vision of the future from these billionaires that what the future is going to look like is us kind of moving into space mining for the minerals that we need instead of doing it on Earth, creating these space colonies or colonizing Mars. All of this kind of vision of we need to get off of the planet because on one hand we're destroying the planet, but on the other hand, like, we need to grow the population, we need more resources. These are the demands of capitalism, essentially, right? But it's not put in those words.
Yeah, and what is it? Bezos says what? How many people do we need? We do expand the population of the Earth.
Trillion,
a trillion. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And like Musk says similar things, right? Like, Musk is very concerned about a decline in the population because if you think about it, capitalism needs infinite growth, and if the population is declining or there's not more resources to extract, then that growth is simply not going to happen, or is going to become much more difficult to achieve, right? So it's not hard to see why they come up with these visions of the future where we go into space, because capitalism at some point will necessitate it, because there's only so much that you can commodify here on Earth.
Right.
But then, like, the deeper worry that I have about that is that when we start to kind of see the future of our society in that way, then we ignore other things that are really essential. And in the same way that we talked about earlier, where so many of these visions turn out to be like bunk and don't actually deliver on what they promise they're going to deliver. Like, this is absolutely another case of that. We are not going to be doing all this asteroid mining in like a few decades. We are not going to be colonizing Mars anytime soon, because, one of the aspects that they never talk about is how we'd all get cancer if we move to Mars.
Right, exactly. That's never anywhere in like the discussions of it. Well, what about the radiation? Never mind. There's no magnetic field on Mars. Never mind. Anyways.
Yeah, exactly. And so, like, you talked about the left there, like, one of the visions of this that I critique, that I've written a few pieces about, is, fully automated luxury communism, right, that Aaron Bastoni has put forward. And like, I think that is a really worrying vision, because when we are buying into the visions put forward by these space capitalists, as I call them, then we're kind of buying that what they're saying is accurate. Like, the foundation that we're building upon is cemented, like is not going to fall apart, basically. And I think that's wrong. And so, like, if we're depending on asteroid mining to be able to deliver the resources that we need to build the electric cars, the batteries that go in them, the renewable energies, and all these things that just allow for us to like massively expand our consumption and thus economic growth, then we're going to massively expand consumption and resource demand, but we are not going to have the asteroid mines to fuel that, right? Because it's just uneconomical, however you look at it. Like, I'm really not convinced.
And if you did it, you would only deepen the inequalities too, right? You would further concentrate the wealth into fewer hands. Even if you were to project that out as a possibility that was like had some sort of realistic, chance of being, come to be.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. And so that's the worry, right? Because we're being distracted from the things that we need to do right now to deal with inequality, to deal with the climate crisis, to deal with these other issues that we face. And we're being told that there's this fanciful tech solution that is going to save us. But those tech solutions never materialize in the way that we're promised they do. Right. And, maybe this is the one time they will, but I really don't believe that. And I think that we'd be wrong to kind of put all of our eggs in that basket and just hope that it works out. And then we have runaway climate change because these billionaires lied to us again, and we fell for it, right? So, like, that's the real deep concern that I have. If we're distracted by these space visions and pursuing this kind of vision of the future, then we're missing out on the actions that we actually need to be taking to kind of rein in the harm that we're causing to this planet. And ultimately, those harms are going to come back and affect us. And it's not going to affect the billionaires who are thinking up these visions, because they'll always be able to buy their way out. It will affect the people that they're already exploiting and whose lives they're making worse. And it will just make them even worse yet again.
Absolutely. I'm right there with you. One of the things that I want to open up if anybody wants to kind of call in, you got a kind of question, you got a comment, remind everybody that I'm talking to Paris Marx here. He is the creator and host of the Tech Won't Save Us podcast. You can go check that out at techwon'tsave.us, techwon'tsave.us. You can also help support his podcast at patreon.com/techwon'tsaveus. And you can follow him on Twitter at Paris Marx, and follow the podcast at Tech Won't Save Us. And this is Kevin Mahoney, and this is Out to Coop Live. You can help support this podcast by going to patreon.com/rcpress. And one of the things that I would like, just to follow up to see if anybody would like to call in, please. You got a comment, got a question, awesome, jump on. One of the things that you were just talking about that I wanted to kind of pick up on was, I think about what our imaginary is, right? What we project out in our imaginary and the impact that it has back on where we are now. And this is how concrete it gets for me, right? If we're projecting out a future in which, like, these, like there's this techno utopia from the left, right? Even for that matter, right? It has impacts on how we think about decisions that are being made now. And I look at the coronavirus as the perfect example of this, right? Is like in the US especially. I mean, we're like the freaks of the world right now, right? I mean, is like the idea is that we're going to wait around, right, for the miracle, the technological solution of the vaccine, right, at the expense of putting on a freaking mask, right? And so what it does is it turns our eyes towards, like, the drama of Pfizer, the drama of, like, the development of the vaccine. And I don't want to minimize that at all, okay? Because, I mean, it's incredible what's happening at the vaccine front. Okay, put that aside. But how it turns our attention to the people at the top, to the corporate overlords, right? To the billionaires, to these corporations to save us, as opposed to turning to each other to protect each other. And the narrative that we're going to kind of look to these, Silicon Valley techno gods for our solutions, right? As opposed to the solutions being found in each other, right? That for me is one of the potentially most devastating consequences of that dynamic. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think if you want to look at, like, the vaccine development process, it's like, there's this focus on the corporations. Are we going to get it from Pfizer? Is Moderna going to come through for us?
It's like a freaking horse race.
Yeah. But
I'm like nationalize everything, right? It's like,
absolutely. Like, it ignores the deeper harms of these companies who have been making, like, huge profits by denying people access to medications for decades, because that's their business model, by charging too high prices, so most people can't access it, or not everyone who needs them. But it also, like, it makes us focus on the corporation and not on the scientists who are, like, doing that work. But it also makes us, by focusing on the corporation, it makes it seem like this private company is, like, doing all this work, funding all this development. And not that so much of that is being funded through public dollars, right? Exactly. And so it allows us to completely ignore that aspect of it again, and give the private companies the credit for it. Like, in the same way that, you hear Elon Musk doing all the space stuff, but you don't hear so much about how all that space stuff is funded by grants from the US government and loans and all this kind of stuff, right? Same with Tesla, and how he got a ton of public funding for Tesla. Like, all of these billionaires are created from this whole system of, like, incentives and subsidies and whatnot from the government that have made it possible for them to exist in the first place. But instead, we kind of laud these billionaires or these companies and act like it's all, because of some singular genius or something, when that's not at all how any of this works.
Exactly. I mean, if we even take, like, SpaceX is a perfect example of this, is there is no SpaceX if there was no NASA, right? I mean, the very fact that SpaceX is launching its rockets, right, from the space that, the Apollo missions launched from, right? That was a public infrastructure bill, right? I mean, it's like SpaceX didn't build that. It's like, and I'm talking about, that's like generations, right, of infrastructure development and scientific knowledge and accumulation that have been supported by the public, right? And not to mention exactly what you're saying, right? Before we even get to the point of, like, the millions, billions of dollars that are being funneled into those industries now, just to prop them up. And that is true right across the board. I mean, for all these kind of big tech companies that are kind of, having such a say on our future. So we've only got a few minutes left. So if anybody wants to jump in, if they want to, have got a question or a comment or like to join the discussion, please do so on the Podbean app. You can also type out your comments for those folks who are looking at us over on YouTube, if you have anything that you'd like to throw in. So Now I understand. Now we didn't talk ahead about this time, but I understand. I was, this is like, me prepping for the show and stuff like this, and came across, see that you're kind of working on this project for like Verso Books, right? And I saw a couple of parts of your talks. You're kind of talking about kind of transportation infrastructure. Is that correct?
Yep.
So where's that project taking you? What do you got next online?
Yeah, so the Verso book is almost like the culmination of some research that I've been doing for the past couple of years.
Mm-hmm.
So as you said, like I started my PhD recently, but my master's research was focused on what tech companies are doing in transportation, the ideas that they're proposing for the future of transportation. And so that specifically looked at electric cars, ride-hailing vehicles, self-driving cars, the Boring Company, and flying cars, right? And so I kind of dug into what the companies and executives were saying about these visions for the future, these potential transportation modes. And then in the cases of the ones that kind of already exist, I looked at, what the impact actually was and how so much of that impact is completely contradictory to what they initially promised it would look like. And then in those that, like the Boring Company and flying cars, which are not really operational yet, I would say, they have that kind of that tunnel in Las Vegas, and that even further adds to my point that it's nothing like what it was initially promised.
Right.
But in those cases, like I kind of looked at the documents and the statements and things and saw, okay, these are the things that they're saying about this, but what are the likely implications, like even if it plays out as they're promoting it? And like, for the flying cars, like even though a lot of the rhetoric is about kind of like the future of transportation, more efficient transportation, all this kind of stuff, like you can see just in the documents, in the statements, that it's completely set in a transportation system that is still completely oriented around cars, and in particular ride-hailing vehicles, because that's Uber's main business, right?
Right.
And so basically the goal of the book is to kind of bring this together along with some other research that I've done and some new research for the book as well, to kind of look at tech's visions for the future of transportation, illustrate how they are not going to solve the problems of the existing transportation system and how they kind of fit into this broader history of like automobility and things not solving those problems and even creating more problems. And then, the goal at the end is kind of to outline a different vision for a different kind of transportation system that is more equitable and would actually kind of deliver on, a better transportation system for the people who need it most, instead of just, further prioritizing billionaires and rather well-off tech workers in our visions for the future of transportation.
Fantastic. Well, hey, man, I really appreciate your time today and taking this time out, taking a shot on some dude down in Southwest Pennsylvania or Southeast Pennsylvania. No, I appreciate it. And, it's been a great conversation. And, I wish you all the well once you get the head down to New Zealand. I got to admit, I'm a little bit envious because of what the hell, what the Labour Party is doing down there has been extraordinary. And that's not even, and again, I think we get a very limited view of what's happening in politics on the ground there. But the politics of New Zealand right now are just absolutely fascinating. And you're going to be down there. So
definitely. No, I really appreciate the kind words about the podcast and my writing, and for having me on today. I've really enjoyed the conversation, and I thought we touched on so many important topics. So thanks so much.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for joining us. We want to remind everybody that you can follow Paris at Paris Marx on Twitter, or you can follow his podcast, Tech Won't Save Us, at Tech Won't Save Us. And you can now support his podcast at patreon.com/Tech Won't Save Us. That's patreon.com/Tech Won't Save Us. And you can download that podcast for everywhere you get your podcast. New podcasts come out every Thursday. Is that right?
Yep, that's right. Every Thursday morning. You could check it out. I'll tell you, it's been one of my motivations to be walking my dog more with my earphones in and listen to the podcast on the way. It's just been fantastic. And we'll remind everybody, you want more progressive talk, you want more kind of the left in Pennsylvania right here. Make sure you check out the Rick Smith Show. You go to ricksmithshow.com. You can check him out on the weekends at Free Speech TV at 7 p.m. Eastern. And you can download his podcast, daily podcast, wherever you get your podcast. Well,
Paris, take it easy. Best to you. And, I'll be looking for that next episode dropping this week. So we'll see you then.
Thanks so much. Yeah, it was great to chat. Bye-bye.
All right, we'll see you. All right, this has been Kevin Mahoney, Raging Chickens, Out to Coop podcast. You can help support this podcast and expand the work that we're doing by going to patreon.com/rcpress. That's patreon.com/rcpress. Become a patron for as little as $5 a month, and you can help support building Pull No Punches, homegrown, punch you in the mouth media right here in Pennsylvania. All right, we're going to be out of here. We're going to talk to everybody next week. I think we got someone lined up for Out the Coop Live for next week. I don't want to drop it yet, though, until I get confirmation. If not, we'll see you Friday for regular Out the Coop. Wishing you all good. See ya!
My face, my arm.